It's over.
Thanks for coming out.
Thanks. I appreciate it. Make sure to buy some merch. I'll take whatever you got. When I was 9, we moved from Winter Park, Florida to Detroit. It was February. Somewhere in North Georgia, I started to see snow. I'd never seen snow before. I remember seeing snow covering Tudor-style apartment complexes that were being built all over the country at the time. In my mind, it looked like Switzerland. In my mind, the apartment complexes looked like Swiss chalets. At the time, I'd never left the country and I'd never seen a chalet. When I was in the Army, I wrote a Hunter S. Thompson quote on a homemade table in my friend's room. When the going gets weird, the weird turn pro. Later, the table was confiscated in a health and welfare raid, also known as a drug raid. The military police brought me into their office. They grilled me about why I wrote this and what it meant. I kept saying, I don't know what it means. I thought if I wrote it down, I could understand it better. They asked, why would you want to understand it better if you didn't know what it meant? I said, because I'm a curious person. That's Ralph Eaton. I just want to be funnier than old Carl. I used to stay at a cheap motel on Biscayne Boulevard in Miami. 15 years ago, the last time I stayed there, you couldn't make reservations. You had to show up and take a chance that you would get a room. There was a handwritten sign in the lobby window. It said something about scenes from Dexter and Donnie Brasco were filmed here. I'd never seen either at the time. Last time I stayed there I stayed for 5 days. I was doing some work for Art Basel. The first morning I was headed for work. I turned the door handle to exit the room. The handle spun. I called the front desk. It was a family-owned place. The family was from Korea. The father came upstairs to my room within minutes. He yelled through the door. He had an accent. He said, "Mr. Greene, please move away from the door." I did. He asked if I'd moved away. I said yes. I heard it slam. The door handle flew across the room. He had hit it with a hammer. He moved me to the room next door. When I got home from Miami, I decided to watch Dexter for the first time. The opening scene of the pilot showed a dead person at the bottom of a pool without water. It was the motel I'd stayed at. When I stayed there, it didn't have water either. I lived in Gainesville in the mid-'80s. A woman I was dating and living with was going to the University of Florida. I was bartending, taking some classes at the community college. I used to go over to a friend's house. He lived in an area that people used to call the student ghetto. We used to lift weights. We probably did about a 15-minute workout in a couple of hours between smoking joints, listening to The Clash, and strumming our guitar. We both had seen a guy around town that looked to be about 40. We both described him as looking like a homeless bodybuilder. One day we heard a craggy voice yelling at us. I looked at the top steps of a tenement next door. It was him. He said, "I'll be right down." His name was Billy Soul. He was intense. We weren't. We started to show more results from lifting weights. He was like a coach who was part Newt Rockney, part One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. He was always very serious. His girlfriend, who was his age, used to pat us on the ass and touch our arms and chest and say how strong we were getting. One day, he had some friends come by. They looked like the Manson family. They scared us. We tried to be serious because they were humorless. A few months after we arrived in Detroit, America's worst hold on. Excuse me. Ralph makes me nervous. A few months after we arrived in Detroit, America's worst race riot of the 20th century was happening. We could hear gunshots from our house. It didn't make any sense to me. A lot of the parents were saying things like black people are violent. My father said, I don't blame the blacks because they're used as targets in the Vietnam War, and they aren't treated any better when they get home. I played Little League for the first time when I was in the 4th grade. I was terrible. I didn't really get it. Later I became a good player, but that year, a guy named Larry and I were the worst players on the team. I used to go to Larry's house after school and play catch. I didn't really have any friends at the time. I thought Larry was boring, but I didn't have anybody else. He went to the Catholic school, I went to the public school. One reason I liked going there was because his sister was a year older than I was and she was cute. Their cousin, who was my age, came over and she was also cute. One day when I walked into the house to use the bathroom, Larry's sister asked me to come upstairs. I went. A few minutes later, I was sitting between the two girls. I would kiss one, then the other. We kissed on the lips. I had no idea that opening your mouth was something people did, and I'm sure I would have been disgusted by the idea. We did this every day, probably not as many days as I remember. It was the same routine. I would play catch for a little while. I'd have to go inside and pretend to have to use the bathroom. One day, their father walked in while we were kissing. He said, "You little son of a bitch." I ran away. Larry never invited me to play catch again. My friend in Gainesville was recounting the days when Billy Soul was his neighbor. Billy had what looked like homemade prison weights. He had plastic gallon milk jugs filled with cement and an array of mismatched weights. My friend said he went into his place, the refrigerator was filled with bags from McDonald's. Billy had worked out something with the nearby McDonald's. When it was around 10:30 a.m. and breakfast was finished, they would bag any remaining Egg McMuffins or whatever they had and give it to Billy. One day when my friend was headed back to Orlando, Billy asked him to go by his father's place and pick up a check. Billy's father lived in a very expensive Winter Park neighborhood. My friend described the house as a mansion. I think it's the same neighborhood that Carrot Top lives in. When Billy's father came to the door, he said, "You must be Billy's friend." He gave him an envelope. He asked, "How's Billy?" "Never mind, I can imagine." My friend described the father as being very dignified. He was a former physics professor. One night during late night experiments, he inadvertently invented the weenie roller, the kind you see at the 7-Eleven that keeps hot dogs warm. Billy's father quit teaching and became a very wealthy man. might have a band. My father was drafted in the Army when we were in Detroit. He used to send us letters from Thailand, where he was stationed. He would talk about Army shenanigans, the beautiful scenery, and how peaceful the Thai people are. He said it's because they're Buddhists. Later we found out he wasn't in the Army, he was in jail in Florida for writing bad checks. About 10 years ago, my brother and I brought up the letters. We were laughing because he wrote letters pretending to be in Thailand. My brother and I mentioned something about Buddhist people. When we mentioned this to our mother, she said he never wrote us letters. In Gainesville, I worked as a bartender at a New Orleans-style seafood place. The two guys who owned it were rumored to have bought the place with drug smuggling money. My manager was an annoying sort of pretty boy, pseudo-intellectual. He read the New York Times every afternoon, made a point of saying he read the New York Times every day. A few times a week, the writer Harry Cruz would come by early, around 5:30 p.m. for dinner. He was around 50 at the time, and he usually had a couple of attractive co-eds with him. Our manager, I can't remember his name, was starstruck. He would suck up to Harry. Harry was usually sort of surly. He was a big guy who looked like he'd had his nose broken a few times. He was often referred to as a redneck Hemingway. It was a little sad watching the manager try to get the attention of Harry. Harry had the reputation as being a drunk brawler. It was rumored that he kept a bottle of booze in his desk at the university. He taught in the English department at the University of Florida. One night after we closed at 11, the manager went over to the bar next door and saw Harry and when that bar closed at 2, he invited a few others to the restaurant and closed it up and had a private party. The next day I came in for my 4:30 p.m. shift. The manager was in a bad mood. He was stomping around. I heard him say, "Fucking Harry Cruz" a few times. I asked the chef, who was not a fan of the manager, what happened. He said, "I'm not sure, but I think it has something to do with Harry Cruz." The chef and I walked up to the manager and asked what was wrong. He said, "Come here." We followed him outside through the front door. The manager pointed to the buildings that were around 100 years old and were being restored. The manager pointed to a hole in the drywall that looked like the outline of where a body had gone through. You could see where the arms had dragged behind. The manager was a little over 6 feet, probably 180 pounds. He said, "I fucking invited Harry Cruz over last night as my guest, and the motherfucker threw me through the drywall." The chef and I were trying not to laugh, but we laughed. The manager said, "It's not funny. I could have been hurt." The chef said, "You weren't hurt, so it's a good story." Around 5:30 p.m., Harry Cruz came strolling in with a couple of co-eds. He glanced at the manager and nonchalantly said, "Hey, sorry about last night."